day. Remembering that the Girondins have now been expelled from the National Convention. So the National Convention, as you can see in this picture, is now purely dominated by people who are proclaiming that they are aligned with the Jacobin Club. So remembering back originally, the Girondins used to sit on the right-hand side and the Jacobin members used to sit on the left. And generally they were given the nickname of Montagnards, or the Mountain Men, because they sat, as you can see in this picture, up high to the left looking down. Well, now this is the National Convention. This is what it looks like. This is all the deputies, 749 of them. Remember, there's no Girondins in this new National Convention. That group that sat in the middle, that were 389 men who were undecided or independent. Because of the assassination of Marat, they've clearly sided with the Jacobin Club because they can sense that the revolution is sort of shifting towards this violent angle, and Jacobin Club has the profound influence over the sans-culottes, and we're in the heart of Paris, remembering. So the sans-culottes can put pressure on the government, so these undecided are now siding with the radical side of the Jacobin Club. So these men are now seen as moderates, so they're not as extreme and violent as the other side of the Jacobin Club. And what you can see is, down here there's an arrow pointing up to Speaker of the House. We need a Speaker of the House, and this is where we see Maximilien Robespierre sort of come to his preeminence and his rise. You've heard about Marat, who is now dead, and Danton. They had a lot of influence in the Revolutionary Commune, and they obviously had a lot of influence over the sans-culottes. But we also now see the positioning of Maximilien Robespierre, who is positioning himself as Speaker of the House. When you're Speaker of the House, it means that you get to dictate who comes up and speaks, and you sort of control the debate. So by putting himself in that position, he will ultimately control what sort of passes, what's discussed, and have a large influence over what the National Convention passes. We now move into an element of the revolution where we see the people in the countryside who are not being given a voice and not being heard, who have been totally neglected because everything has just been centralised in Paris. People have only been concerned about the sufferings of Paris, and that's because the National Convention is based there. So they're responding to what they see outside of their chambers, outside of their doors. But did everyone support the radical direction the revolution had taken? And the simple answer to that is no. Not everybody in France wanted the revolution to move in this extreme manner. So now we need to look at two events where people from rural areas and sort of larger regional areas are disgusted by what is happening in Paris, and they take a stand against the National Convention and their revolutionary army. So we begin with the Vendee Uprising. Vendee Uprising occurred between March to December 1793. So following on, in between that time, we will have the murder of Marat, which will incite things a lot more. But the uprisings begin in March of 1793, so a couple of months after King Louis has been executed. Vendee, if you can look at the map, Vendee is a rural region. If you were to go by carriage, it would take you about a day's journey to get to Paris. So once the National Convention obviously hears about the uprising and the revolts that are happening in this countryside region, it will take their troops about a day to get there to obviously stop these revolts. So we need to examine why the people in Vendee, this rural area, why were they upset to begin with? They were largely populated by peasants, and you would notice that up until this point now in the new regime, it's been predominantly based in Paris, and we're hearing a lot about the sans-culottes and their suffering. But how much have we heard about the suffering of the peasants, and how are the peasants' suffering being alleviated by all these consecutive governments? Well, they're just not. So this region was upset at the direction that the revolution was taking. They had been promised so much in the ideals of the Dormac, the Declaration of Rights of Man Citizen, which declared that all men were born equal and free. Yet up till right now, they're not feeling like they've been born free and equal. They're feeling like they're continuing just like they were in the old regime, to be totally disregarded and not heard from. They were upset that the consecutive governments, so we've had the National Assembly, the Legislative Assembly, in between there we have the National Constituent Assembly, so we've had 3 forms of government, and now we're at our 4th, the National Convention. They just feel that all these governments have completely bypassed them through all the processes. Number one, they are very upset by how the Catholic Church has been treated. They are upset by the civil constitution of the clergy, because they are strongly Catholic and they don't like to see that their religion has been shattered and broken apart for the purpose of creating money and for punishing a pillar that King Louis used. So they're upset by the attack on their religion. What they're mostly upset by, though, is the pressure that is put on their local priests to swear the clerical oath. Got to remember that the Vendee rural provinces didn't see too much of archbishops and bishops, but they did liaison and have a lot of collaboration with the local priests, who were just ultimately as poor as them. And now they're watching these men be forced to sign an oath which says, I belong to a revolution and I disregard my pope and I disregard my church. And so 90% of the priests that were actually in Vendee refused to sign this oath. And clearly they are now seen as counter-revolutionaries, and a large contingent of them were the ones that were housed in the prisons and were a lot of the ones that were massacred during those days in September, in the September massacres. Again, this region is upset because they're predominantly peasants and their standard of living has not improved. They're just as bad as they were under King Louis and the old regime. So they've seen over the course of 4 years, no change in their lifestyle and no change in their sufferings. But ultimately, they were particularly upset with the newly elected National Convention because the National Convention, obviously in a time of war, is running out of soldiers on the front line. So they're forced conscription, and when conscription is generally forced, it's generally enforced on the peasantry. They're upset that the bourgeoisie in the towns get to escape going to the front line because the bourgeoisie can naturally sign up and become the National Guard. So conscription is forced on the peasants, and they absolutely resent having to leave their farms. They also resent the fact that they could not buy church lands, and they resented the fact that the bourgeoisie, who they saw as being the biggest profiteers at this moment in the revolution, at the expense of them. So remembering that they once all belonged in the third estate, they once all all were trying to fight for equality. And as the revolutions progressed, it seems to be that the bourgeoisie succeed in excelling at the expense of their one-time companion in the third estate. Also, this region was shocked by the brutality and violence that had been committed at the September massacres, and even though they didn't agree with everything King Louis did, they still saw him as their father, and so they are notably distressed by the way in which he meets his end. So how did the region of Vendee challenge the National Convention? These peasants decide to take up arms and storm towns, and they took over whole parts of the Vendee region. When they were storming these towns, they stormed their local governments, and in their local governments, you gotta remember, would be predominantly Jacobin members. So, of course, it gets back to the National Convention that the people of Vendee are uprising. They're ultimately challenging the National Convention, and they're saying, hey, you're not listening to us. You need to listen to us. They're using guerrilla warfare. So they're obviously getting down on the ground, they're using their physical presence, they're intimidating through the use of weaponry. And the way that they go about challenging the National Convention is that they actually form their own army, which they call the Catholic and Royal Army. That indicates clearly that they're trying to uphold and support the Catholic Church, and they've added the word royal. How did the region of Vendee challenge the National Convention? Well, first and foremost, they challenged them because the peasants actually organised their own army. And this army of rebels, they called themselves the Catholic and Royal Army. So thereby they're challenging the National Convention because they're setting up an army that is not ordained or supported by the National Convention. The second way that they're challenging the National Convention is they're actually using this army to storm rural towns, and they're obviously quite clearly taken over the region of Vendee, which was quite a large region. So they're challenging the National Convention because they're taking territory, they're taking land, they're taking ownership of a certain area. Clearly, when the Jacobins in the National Convention hear of the uprising that is occurring in this region, they send in their armies to repress this rebellion. So therefore, the Catholic and Royal Army, which is clearly made up of the peasants of Vendee region, the way that they go about fighting the National Convention is they commit guerrilla warfare, which is obviously guerrilla warfare is using your surrounds. So they obviously knew their mountains well, they knew their hills well, they knew all their hideaway spots. So they were positioning themselves within the landscape to attack the National Convention when they sent their royal armies to Vendee. They also planned to challenge the National Convention by seizing a French port. And what they wanted to do was make sure that they could open a way for the British to come in and invade. So at this point of the war, we're fighting Austria and we're fighting Prussia, but other nations have stepped up and said, we need to squash what is happening in France. So Great Britain and the likes of Spain have joined this war against France. So the Vendee peasants see themselves as trying to open a port to make sure that we can get these foreign powers in, and hopefully along with their army and foreign powers, we might bring down this National Convention and we might restore a bit of calm to the revolution. How did the National Convention respond to this challenge? Well, it's only quite clearly and simply how would the National Convention respond. Clearly they're going to want to get to the Vendee region as quick as they can and repress these revolts to make sure that the peasants in these areas are not taking any more territory, are not inspiring any more people across the countryside to join their Catholic and Royal Army. So they want to swiftly and forcefully deal with it. They want to stop this civil war, which is obviously countrymen fighting countrymen. They don't want it to break out anywhere else. So the National Convention sends in their revolutionary armies, which is made up predominantly of National Guardsmen and sans-culottes. They send them to the region to repress them completely. When the Revolutionary Army get to the Vendee region, they don't just repress them, they absolutely slaughter and butcher them. This is probably this is the biggest incident and event in the French Revolution, but it's one of the biggest annihilations of people outside of world wars. Peasant women suffer horrific rapes, children are butchered and hung from trees. The estimate of how many people will die over the course of these months and the next year in this Vendee region is put between 50,000 to 200,000 people. So this event is a turning point because it signals that the National Convention is willing to use extreme terror to control the country. They will repress any opposing voice, army, any opposing element at any cost, and they will use extreme violence to silence their opposition. Vendee was the epicenter of the largest counter-revolutionary uprising of the entire French Revolution, so this event is the biggest incident of rebellion against the government, and it is also the event where we have the biggest loss in numbers. What followed after Vendee was a campaign of incidents that bordered on genocide. Under the direction of National Convention from Paris, revolutionary forces would begin slaughtering any regions, provinces, or any areas. They didn't care what age or what genders or what activities. Anybody who tries to revolt against the government from this point on will meet their maker through terror, and they will be silenced through death. As a result of this event, it sparks revolts, which will become known as the Federalist Revolts. So it's going to spark another challenge for the National Convention because other populations, mainly in regional areas, so remembering that rural areas is the countryside and regional areas are areas just outside of Paris, so there are other large cities. So we're going to have other large cities who see what's happened in Vendee, hear about the brutality, the rapes, the murder, the butchering, and they too think, you know what, this National Convention has taken this revolution beyond what was proclaimed in the doormat. The doormat is being flipped on its head. It doesn't even exist anymore. We need to do something to...
And as the wars became more serious, the revolutionary government introduced conscription. All young men had to leave their homes and families and join the army. For many in provincial France, it was the last straw. They thought, if we have to risk our lives, let's do it for a cause we believe in.
And so uprisings against the revolution broke out. In Marseille, in Lyon, in Bordeaux, and in Caen, people began to fight back. But it was here in the Vendee, the region around Les Luc, where the uprisings were most significant.
From 1791, groups of Vendeans were using the countryside to launch surprise attacks against the National Guard. By the spring of 1793, the rebels were organised into an army, the Grand Catholic and Royal Army. They dressed in smocks or rough coats. They armed themselves with shotguns, pistols, muskets or tools. They conquered one town after another. They even set up a rival government.
But Paris wasn't going to take this lying down, and so a revolutionary army was sent to the Vendee with a chilling brief.
You are authorized to use terror wherever you see fit, whether it is burning the principal rebel towns or executing troublesome peasants to bring the region to order.
Faced with large numbers of well-armed, disciplined troops, the Vendeans suffered one defeat after another. By early 1794, it was all over. The Grand Army had collapsed, the survivors forced to hide out in the woods.
But that's when the revolution took its revenge. The Revolutionary Army, organised into so-called death columns, attacked towns and villages, killing everyone they found. They used bullets, they used guillotines, and they invented what they called mockingly the patriotic baptism, chaining prisoners to barges and then sinking them in the river. As one Republican official put it,
"These bandits complained they were dying of hunger, but they can't complain they were dying of thirst."
In all, it's said 250,000 Vendeans were killed during the revolt and in the aftermath.
That we need to listen to before you sit down to commence SAC 2, which is to write 2 short answer responses. We've just had the Vendee Uprising, where peasants have formed their own rebel army. They've named themselves the Catholic and Royal Army. They have tried to take over the Vendee region. They have tried to send out their message that we of the countryside want to be listened. You in Paris National Convention, you need to take our voices and consider our suffering. In response, the National Convention, who at this point is not taking any opposing voices, they have swiftly and forcefully sent in their Revolutionary Army, which is the National Guardsmen and sans-culottes. And what those men have done over the preceding weeks, months, and particularly year, they have gone in and butchered between 50,000 to 200,000 people in that region. So they have zoned in on an area and completely quelled any opposition within it. Clearly, we live in a country where messages get through people travelling to the next town and saying, "Oh my God, do you know what's happening in the Vendee region?" So eventually, over the coming weeks, people in other areas are going to hear about what happened in Vendee, and they themselves are going to look at each other and go, "You know what? Everything is centralised in Paris. We need to put pressure on the National Convention to actually rule for all, not just for those who live in the capital city." So the Federalist revolts will occur after the Vendee Uprising, so they'll happen between the months of June and October 1793. Where will these rebellions take place? In regional areas. So regional areas are also rural areas, but they're bigger. They're bigger than little towns, so they're also large cities. cities that you may have heard of, such as Lyon and Bordeaux and Marseille. Okay, so we have these regions that aren't too far from Paris, and they are going to band together to uprise. Large groups of people from large regional areas outside of Paris were angered that the government were continually being pressured by the sans-culottes. The sans-culottes were continually using their right to direct democracy. Remembering that direct democracy was when you can use your power in numbers to assemble and insert pressure on the government. The sans-culottes were also using their right to insurrection, so they were using their right to mobilise and rebel. And this continual rebellion obviously always sends a little bit of fear into the National Convention. And as a result, the National Convention often give in to the sans-culottes' wants and needs, just because we're in Paris. That's where the majority of sans-culottes clearly are. And they keep continually putting pressure on the National Convention. And the National Convention responds by continually giving in to their wants and their needs. But by doing that, they are neglecting everybody else that is in the countryside. The people in these regional areas are also bitter that the revolution is solely focused on Paris. They felt that the elective representatives in the National Convention were totally disregarding the sufferings of anyone outside of Paris. Thirdly, they're completely sickened by the level of violence that the National Convention is allowing to take place in the name of revolution. They're especially the violence that has been committed at Vendee, which saw, as I've said, the slaughtering of 50 to 200,000 people, make it one of the largest terrorist attacks in human history. But ultimately, the people of these regional areas, their last motive is that the last motive that would fuel this group will to fight the sans-culottes and their revolutionary leaders and armies was the expulsion of the Girondins from the National Convention following Marat's death. Now that the Girondins, who were from, remembering, regional rural areas, have been kicked out of the National Convention, it means that the convention is completely dominated by people aligned to the Jacobin Club. So the people of these regional areas believe the revolution was only going to become more radical if they didn't stand up and revolt now. If we don't stand up and revolt now, what's happened in Vendee is just going to happen completely across the country. So what happens in these Federalist revolts? Men and women in regional areas mentioned prior on the other slide, they seize their local councils off Jacobin deputies, so they go into their local councils who obviously are being run by people who are aligned with the National Convention, so clearly people who state themselves as being Jacobin members. They run those people out. They then tried to raise their own army. They tried to get about 10,000 men to commit to going to Paris. They wanted to march into Paris. They wanted to march to the doors of the National Convention, which, remember, was at Tuileries Palace. They wanted to go in there and demand that the Jacobin deputies return those Girondins that they had expelled. They believed that only once the Girondins got back into being part of the National Convention that the revolution could calm down and that the Dormac would be something that is again looked at and is upheld. However, their plans were stopped because the National Convention obviously gets wind and word that more skirmishes are happening in these areas outside of Paris. They swiftly and again forcefully send in their revolutionary army to squash the rebellion. What they do over the next coming months is they find people who have revolted in these areas, and without a fair and free trial, they execute 2,000 of them. This is a turning point in the revolution because we are now realising that the National Convention, so primarily the Jacobins, are justifying their butchery of anyone who is opposing them, because they're saying that anyone who breaks out and revolts and protests against the National Convention is committing treachery, so treason, so they can be ultimately executed for that. Although the Federalist revolts were squashed quite easily, they did harm the revolution because they took revolutionary troops away from the war with Austria and Prussia and the other European nations. So obviously to squash all this civil war, the National Convention is going, oh my God, we're going to have to take some troops from the front line to squash all these little skirmishes that are happening around France. So that takes from the war, and of course that means that those European nations can start gaining more ground and more territories off France. But ultimately, these revolts increase the mood of crisis, they increase the uncertainty, and they produce a great amount of fear. So where will the National Convention go from here? How are they going to respond to any further challenges?